Tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. How has your daily life been affected by the US tariffs? We have our friend Professor Zhong Gong, an economist and expert on the US economy from the University of International Business and Economics. Join me, Shen Shui, as we spotlight the impacts of the US tariffs on our daily life. So, Professor Zhong Gong, as we know, the U.S. Trump administration has spent its first 100 days in office imposing a series of tariffs against over 180 countries and regions, even to the islands where only the penguins are living there. But so some people criticize these kind of policies as a flip-flopping game. So, do you think it's kind of political maneuvering or is part of the U.S. strategy plan or any plan?
I don't think it's part of the plan. I think the original plan is to impose tariffs on all these countries. President Trump pretty much followed the blueprint as depicted in the Project 2025. But I think it's very clear that the strategy has been adjusting along the way. Originally it started out with targeting all these countries we've been talking about, but now it seems to be focusing on China. I don't think it's a part of the pre-planned strategy. I think it's pretty clear. Also, as actually reported in reported in New York Times and Washington Post that this has been adjustment along the way. So this is not a strategy at all. I think this represents sort of the chaotic nature of the Trump administration all along. It was like that during his first administration, and right now, it's very much characteristic of what his administration is all about. Very chaotic. I think its performance for the 100 days, in one way, can be reflected by the polls. Right? What is the approval rating by the American public for the 100 days in office? And it's reported that this has been the worst of all presidents in the past. The approval rating is, I think it's below 40%, if I remember this correctly. So, this is the worst day presidential performance ever in history. It speaks volume about what he has done so far.
Yeah, so in one way it's kind of chaotic, but there's another perspective that the US is appearing to use this kind of tariff negotiations as kind of negotiation tactics to try to isolate China. But we also see the US allies like Japan has clearly said no. They don't want to be part of this confrontational camp and to block China or whatever. So do you think the US isolation will work?
Yeah, well, I think the idea of isolating China is mostly coming from Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent. He is of this camp that it shouldn't be sort of an all-out war against the entire world. The idea of entirely eviscerating and upending the rules-based international order as represented by the WTO. It's a bad idea, according to him. So he's now focusing on China. But the problem is that it's first of all, it's not easy. I don't think it can be done, very effectively, because other countries have their own national interests, and it's actually indeed in their interest to have a economic relationship with China. A lot of countries around the world have China as the largest trading partner. So I think the idea that somehow the United States can leverage its market for these countries as a leverage to essentially isolate China is something very difficult to do. And so far, the leading countries are pushing back. I think they probably also learned a very important lesson here. There's a very, very famous saying by Kissinger, right? Being an American ally is fatal. Look at what happened to Canada, right? You can't have a closer ally than Canada. But now it's a totally different situation. I mean, the newly elected prime minister has already said that the relationship between the United States and Canada has changed forever. We look at how Donald Trump treats his European allies, how he treats Ukraine. I mean, all these are very vivid lessons of how to deal with the United States. And I think the idea that jumping on this bandwagon against China, being very much dependent upon the United States, it's not just a dangerous idea; it's also a very fatal idea.
You just mentioned about the some countries' export dependence on the U.S. market. Actually, there's also a data from the Chinese side that China's export dependence on the U.S. market has dropped from the previous around 19% to now around 14%. So how do we interpret this data? Does that mean there's kind of a trade diversification?
I think there are two things probably happening here. One, of course, is that the Chinese government learned a very important lesson during the first trade war, during 2018, 2019 timeframe, that reliance upon the United States market is a risky proposition, and we need to change and adapt over time. And I think the second thing that's happening is corporate China itself is also adapting. Let's just be very honest. There are some companies that are very much targeting the United States market, American market, have moved some of their operations to other countries like Vietnam, like Mexico. So, the direct trade from China to the United States is somehow diverted away to these countries. There's also, some part of that also at play here. But overall, if we're talking about the GDP in China that is tied to the U.S. market, as you said, it's about 14%. So this is something that is bearable. I think if you really think about the doomsday scenario, the worst case, right? The worst case, the 400 or 500 billion dollars market is entirely gone. I think probably maybe even more than half of it would be compensated for by the pickup in the domestic market, as well as exports to other markets. And the value added out of that piece is probably another half of it. So we're talking about a quarter of the entire U.S. exports market being gone, in my view, in the worst case scenario. So we're talking about a bit over maybe $100 billion of a loss of GDP, which is a small percentage compared to the China's overall GDP size. Around like 1%, 1.5%. I think it's in that range, maybe even more than 1.5%. I think we're talking about a doomsday scenario. It's not a doomsday scenario from China's economic perspective. It's and now at the end of the day, it's about 1.5% of GDP loss. This is something bearable.
Yes, and so actually from the U.S. side, so they have this kind of impression that they could use their market size and also their economic power to force these trading partners to bend to its will. And so you see how the US is imposing tariffs to Japan, to South Korea, to European allies, and to many African countries. So do you think this kind of bully or forcible policy work in this tariff war?
Yeah, well, I think to many countries, tariff is indeed a fairly effective weapon to leverage. I think there are indeed economies very much tied to the United States. But if we speak of the China situation, it's a very different situation in my view. I think given the geopolitical situation, given the wide consensus in the United States with respect to the foreign policy regarding China, I think it's very clear that over the long run, let me emphasize this. I think this is a very important point. Over the long run, we understand very well that the China-U.S. relationship, at least the economic relationship, is heading towards decoupling, at least a very significant partial decoupling. I think I've said this before through quite a few media venues, that this is the way it is going. I think the issue here is how do we manage this process? We want to manage this process smoothly, less disruptively, less destructively, right? But appears to be, this is also something that's not likely to happen. The Trump administration has chosen to accelerate this process, has chosen to introduce a shock therapy to this. So if this is destined to happen, and if this is what Washington imposes on China, on Beijing, I think my answer is so be it. We are heading towards that direction anyway. This is going to bound to happen in the end. So if this is what they want, they will get what they want. So I think it's a matter of over a period of 5 years or 10 years, or a matter of 2 years or 1 year to complete this process. And I think it looks like probably we're talking more of a shorter time frame here.
Yes, we have seen the economic ties between China and the US is going through a lot of turbulence, and there another trend that the US tariff policy is pushing certain countries much closer. For example, now we have seen a closer ties between the European Union and China. We have seen multiple senior level exchanges and also the visits. So what is your take? Is the China and European Union are getting much closer facing this kind of U.S. tariff pressures?
Well, I would say the following to the politicians, the leaders, the political leaders in Europe. This is more than just about taking a sort of opportunistic approach regarding their relationship with the United States. We are talking about really defending a rules-based international order here. What President Trump is doing very clearly is to essentially eviscerate and upend the rules-based international order as represented by the WTO in this case. He thinks this whole system is not in America's national interest. The system is screwed against U.S. interests, and he wants to totally throw out of the window this entire system. So instead, he's talking about establishing essentially a set of bilateral relationships between the United States and all these countries. It's a hub and spoke system, institution of the WTO. I think the WTO is very important. I think the European leaders still care about a rule-based international order. China and the European Union are probably the only meaningful forces to be able to still work together to defend the system, to keep it going, even without the U.S. participation. I think this is all about, very importantly, about whether we still have a international order here. Without this system, we're going back to the days before the First World War, and certainly the days before the First World War is not in the interest of European countries. So I think this is really a existential struggle right now regarding global governance here, whether we need any rules or not, whether we need any norms or not, regarding free flow of trade and capital and goods, and clearly Washington doesn't want that. So I think it's probably the significance of this is even more goes well beyond just sort of leveraging the relationship with China in dealing with Washington. I think both sides have really, really important interests to work together to somehow at least to defend and maintain the multilateral system here.
Yes, actually, Professor, you just mentioned the U.S. prefer the more bilateral way, not kind of a multilateral way. Just like when he has some talks with the foreign leaders, he would like to have one-on-one. So he can use this kind of his power in this kind of negotiation, like kind of art of the deal. But now we have seen the WTO is the multilateralism is kind of struggling, and many people say will this multilateralism still survive, or we will see a rise of like a regional integration, like the regional blocs is on the rise. So what would be the trend?
Well, I think I think I've said it very clearly that the WTO system, the multilateral system, is very much at risk here. Without China's support, without European Union support, this whole system would be in shambles. I think it's already, not so much far away, being on the deathbed. Trump has withdrawn the dues to the WTO, and I think probably he will also withdraw from the IMF actually.
Oh, really?
Uh,
That would be a
well, I mean,
big,
he has a
shocking.
review. Yeah, but he has a review of U.S. participation in all the international organizations, right? He has withdrawn from the WHO. Keep in mind, is withdrawn from the WHO. He has withdrawn from the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. He has withdrawn from the Climate Accord. He has already withdrawn from a couple of important international organizations. I wouldn't be surprised that he said that is going to withdraw from the IMF. So, I think it's an existential threat right now. So if Europe and China don't work together on this, I think WTO's days are numbered.
Yes, and so you also mentioned like the in China and the U.S. trade, the agricultural part is very important, but now we see it's kind of partially decoupling between the two economies. And so I just also read the report, like the U.S. farmers' losses is the Brazilians' gain, because now we have seen a lot of Brazilian shipments of soybeans are reaching to Chinese ports as the U.S. tariffs has made their soybean and other agricultural commodities are not acceptable under the current tariffs. So, do you think this kind of shift is also representing a changing dynamics of the international trade, especially when the U.S. want to use this pressure, economic pressure, to force China to bend on its will?
Well, I think in the face of these higher tariffs, um, not buying agricultural products from the United States, in my view, is probably one of the most effective weapons in retaliation from China's perspective, because these agricultural products represents farmers' interests in those very important Midwest states like Minnesota, like Iowa, Nebraska. These are pretty much barring Minnesota, I guess. I mean, all these other states are very much Republican-dominated states. In the U.S. politics, we all know very well that the farmer has a disproportionately stronger influence in Washington. So I think this really cuts into the support base, the political support base for Donald Trump. Now, previously, the Trump administration has been relying on the tariff revenues collected to subsidize farmers. He boasted about this during the first trade war. I remember reading something like 50, $60 billion of tariffs being reimbursed to the farmers. This is a way to sort of compensate partially to these farmers who have been hurt by this trade war. But I think this is not sustainable. Clearly it's not sustainable. You can't just subsidize farmers forever. And I'm not even sure that without a trade deal between China and the United States, Washington would be able to collect that amount of tariff revenues from the trade. So I don't think this is sustainable. I think it's a situation that hurts both sides. I think that coming to the negotiating table to strike out some kind of a deal is probably something that both sides should do. Even though there will be tariffs in place, I'm pretty sure if there's a deal to be reached, I think there's still some. As I said, even though we are heading towards partial decoupling, we want to see this process to be managed smoothly, less destructive. Having some kind of a deal is indeed in the interest of both sides. But the problem is that the way Washington acts is condescending, is arrogant, is totally disrespectful. And this is not the way to deal with China. China is not like a small little country that you can throw against the wall. It's a sovereign country with the second largest economy. It's actually the largest economy by the PPP calculation in terms of GDP size. So I think the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has said very clearly that if we want to talk We want to talk on equal terms with respect. So far, it's not happening on Washington's part.
Yes, we have seen the constant changes of the positions and the policies from the White House. And so regarding, you said the agricultural states in the U.S. is also a kind of political base for the Republicans. And I just read a report from the CNN, like those kind of places were hit hard because of this soybean export was also suspended due to the tariffs, and those states where the supporters have gave the vote to this administration. But in another perspective, can we say the U.S. tariff policy is killing its own soybean export industry? Because we see a lot of lobbyists from this industry, they are trying to persuade the White House to just give away from this kind of tariff policies and to give people like a green light in this part.
Yeah, well, certainly from farmers' interest, they would like to just see the trade flow and keeping the soybean, corn, sorghum, and other agricultural products. Pork, for example, is also very important, and beef as well. Going to China is really in the interest of these farmers. The problem is that Trump doesn't view it that way. At least I think, if I remember this correctly, the total amount of the agricultural exports to China amounts to, I think it's definitely less than $50 billion. I think it's like, $30-40 billion, but it's still a very significant amount. And it affects a lot of people. I think the impact can be quite severe in the sense that, it just, in some cases, it can entirely wipe out a lot of farming businesses. I mean, if you understand how this farm business runs, it's actually highly leveraged. Many farmers borrow money in the short run to do a one season of farming, and in the hope of the crop sales will be able to repay the loans and recover the cost of this business during that season. So if one season is not good, it can potentially wipe out the whole business. They can go bankrupt. So I think it's not just some cutback of income for these farmers. In some cases, it's a life and death decision. Actually, it's a very severe blow to a lot of people in the Midwest. I think if this thing continues, more and more farmers got caught in this storm. Ultimately, there will be a political reckoning, if not in the next year's midterm election, but at least I think in year 2028 election. People are going to wake up and figure out what kind of president they have elected in 2024.
Yes, Professor. So actually, besides the agriculture part, for the manufacturing part, the MEGA has promoted the Made in America, but we see like the Amazon, one of the biggest retailers in the US, has said they would like to display the price with tariffs, but this was also strongly criticized by the White House as kind of hostile and political action, but it's just kind of information like to inform the American consumers that they are the real ones who are paying the tariffs. So how do you see these kind of actions by the White House against Amazon?
Well, this is actually very sad in my view. I think the fact that Speaker Leavitt goes out and call this hostile political act on the part of Amazon is clearly a intimidation and a blackmail towards Amazon as a company. I see signs of a tyrannic system here. The Trump administration is more and more becoming like a authoritarian regime. He's using this kind of a scare and intimidation to essentially hold back one of the largest American companies, one of the greatest American companies in history. This is totally unacceptable. This is very, very un-American. Deplorable that the United States politics has degraded to this kind of a level.
Yeah, actually, we have seen a lot of debates among those states. Now we have seen a dozen of states they have sued the Trump administration, and also we have seen the opposition from the major companies like Apple. They also warned these kind of tariffs if they continue to disrupt this global supply chain. That will raise a lot of cost for the manufacturing part. But we have seen the White House didn't respond very actively and doesn't believe that part. So how do you see this kind of conflicts or quarrels between the regional states and the federal government and also especially for the White House?
Well, essentially, what's happening right now is that company executives representing different industries, they go to Washington, essentially begging, in my view, holding things in, trying to ask for some kind of exemption from these very high tariffs. The retail executives went there, you know, Apple went there, HP went there. This is very problematic in my view, in the sense that I'm suspecting this is essentially creating an environment where Donald Trump is essentially waiting to see these executives coming to him to ask for what he thinks is the political favor. And he's saying, "Okay, I'm giving you a break. This is what I did for you. This is political corruption, essentially, isn't it? I mean, this is America has never seen something like this before. That the corporate executives going to Washington with things in hand, essentially acting as beggars. It's a travesty, in view. It's a travesty how things have degraded to this kind of a level. Uh, Admittedly, the Trump administration has greatly expanded its power to the extent of, I would say, even encroaching into the neutrality of the civil employees class, and essentially, I think it's moving towards a authoritarian regime, unfortunately.
Yeah, one last question. We have seen this kind of tariffs has caused a lot of disruptions in global supply chains and manufacturing and business are all affected. So what will be the ultimate results and the cost will be buried by the American consumers, especially for these ordinary families for their daily lives?
Well, from the perspective of American consumers, I'm pretty sure they're going to see higher prices. I mean, look at the prices at Amazon.com, and that actually accounts for the bulk of the expenditures by many households in the United States. They are seeing these costs going up. They're seeing the cost of cars going up. Certainly, the imported auto components and parts, the prices are going up. American consumers will see a big hike in their daily expenditures. From a more of a global perspective, I think we are seeing is that ultimately, in my view, there will be a wall of tariffs in the United States, and probably, hopefully, the rest of the world will still stick with the free trade. But ultimately, what these tariffs are protecting are not just American industries; they're also protecting a increasingly uh, outdated American industries. And I make a joke that after 10 years, maybe American people go to Mexico to find out all of a sudden that the kind of cars they're driving are one generation behind the cars and trucks, pickups driven by Mexican people. That's likely to happen.
All right, thank you, our friend Professor Zhong Gong, for your insights. And Professor Zhong Gong is our friend, and he's an economist and expert on the U.S. economy from the University of International Business and Economics. So join me, Shen Shuwei. Stay tuned for more insights on the international relations and economies. And will focus on the impacts of these tariffs, and we will continue to have more programs. And thank you.